So it's a real delight for me to be able to chair this panel. Some of you may know that I was engaged in research when I was a head teacher into Learning Without Limits. And Learning Without Limits is all about how to look at every child you're working with, every adult that you're working with, actually, frankly, and try and remove limits in terms of perception about what they might achieve in the future. And to remove that kind of sense that the only way to achieve success is through very narrow measures of success, because we're all capable of success in our different approaches. And so it's a real delight to me to introduce the panel. They're going to just to tell you a little bit about themselves, just a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to come back. And the theme of our conversation is going to be, how can we make assessment work for everybody? And I think it's such an important issue, because we know about that Hassall report, about the forgotten third. We know that assessment for everybody is a really tricky aspiration, but an absolutely vital one. No pressure. So I'm going to come to you first. Rachel, could you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Yes, Rachel Macfarlane. I was a teacher for 30 years and a head teacher in and around London for 16 years. My last headship was of an all-through school in East London, which I had the privilege and pleasure of setting up from scratch, and really determinedly planning a curriculum and assessment framework that would allow young people to demonstrate the range of their strengths and areas of expertise. So a sort of balance of knowledge, learning power, and character. I now have a wonderful job where part of the week I'm an independent education consultant, but I also work for HFL Education, a school improvement organisation, as their lead advisor for underserved learners. So that is primarily children eligible for pupil premium, but also all marginalised and minoritised groups, and all learners really who don't have that cavalcade of support from home or out of school, with adults and others who can advocate for them and ensure that they have a sort of equitable playing field on which to navigate education. I'm part of the core team for Rethinking Assessment and have been for the last 4 years, and I've authored a number of books around closing the disadvantage gap, race equity, ensuring that all learners can progress out of our education system as successes rather than feeling that they're failures, and aspects of diversity and inclusion.
Fantastic. Thank you. Annamarie.
How to follow that? Lovely to meet you. I'm Annamarie Hassall, and I'm Chief Exec at NASON, and NASON is the National Association for Special Educational Needs. And our work is all about improving outcomes for learners with SEND, and for improving and developing the confidence and skills of practitioners. Really, it's about their continuing professional development. We're not involved in initial teacher education, but we're certainly involved in the ongoing teaching, training, support, continuing professional development of teachers, teaching assistants, of early years practitioners, and wider workforce. So all the way through from early years to post-16. My professional career is perhaps a bit different to some on the panel. I'm a social worker by background, and still have a badge of honour that I managed to maintain that social work registration now, even though I've moved strategically into education for many, many years. Starting out in social work, working with some of the toughest family circumstances and situations. And I developed the belief that if we could get education right for all children, for all young people, that was the most powerful tool ever, and could really knock the socks off any interventions that could be developed. So that takes me to NASON at this particular point in my career, and I want to knock the socks off everywhere that isn't inclusive, to do all that we can for all learners before I go on to do anything else.
Fantastic. And Sammy, esteemed author.
Thank you. So I don't know about esteemed, but I'm an author. I'm a novelist, and also this year I brought out a book called Examination, which feeds off 23 years teaching, 12 years in London, and for the last 10 years I've been in Sunderland. I'm now head of school in a large secondary. And Examination was my attempt to spend some time travelling around the country, talking to kids, hearing what they felt about education and putting it together into some kind of grand, slightly idiosyncratic narrative about the state of education in Britain today.
And I highly recommend it if you haven't had a chance to have a read. So I'm going to come to you first, Rachel. If you could give us a few minutes around the issues as you see them in relation to race, equity, mental health, through the lens of looking at assessment, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
And I was heartened to hear this wasn't an exam, so this is going to be a little bit sort of open book. We hear a lot, don't we, as educators, around the narrative that exams are the most robust, equal, level playing field, fair way of assessing young people. But I think everybody in this room, clearly knows and painfully feels that exam halls, exam rooms are very different places for different learners. And that high stakes, one shot, pinpoint moment in time of assessing students through standardized formal exams, we know disadvantages our most underserved learners. So children who have English as an additional language are often tripped up by the nuance of the language of the exam rubric. You all will have experienced that. Autistic children will often very directly and literally interpret instructions in papers, which can cause problems. Learners with dyslexia would, give their eye teeth to be able to verbally articulate and demonstrate their knowledge rather than being required to write it down. We know those from lower socioeconomic groups often fail to recognise and therefore connect with the cultural references that crop up regularly in SATS papers, GCSE papers, A-level papers. And the same often applies to children from racially minoritised backgrounds if those cultural references are westernised, which they almost invariably are. You may also be familiar with the research around evidence that groups who are negatively stereotyped perform particularly badly in high-stakes assessment scenarios. So Claude Steele's work back in 2011, looking at black students in parts of America and their performance in standardized tests versus their white counterparts, showed that the negative stereotyping around expectations of their performance led to them experiencing heightened degrees of pressure in exams, which then led to them performing not so well. So you could argue, and people like Ibrahim Zaidi have argued, that exams therefore perpetuate and embed those stereotypes even further. And children in general who have low self-esteem or poor mental health or experience heightened levels of anxiety year after year fail to demonstrate their skills, aptitudes and strengths in the exam hall. I think we would all recognise that to be really successful in written exams, particularly to achieve the top grades, because those exams are so content heavy, practically requires you to have been in school in lessons for 100% of learning time. And when we think of those families who are living in poverty, we know that it's the children in those families who often, for reasons beyond their control, aren't in school because they're more likely to catch the germs, the bugs, the diseases. We saw that very clearly writ large during the COVID pandemic. If they're living in overcrowded housing or they have poorer diet or poorer health, that's going to negatively impact on their ability to have achieved and experienced the whole curriculum. Likewise, children who are moving from one temporary accommodation to another are more likely to experience disruption in their education journey. And that's before we even think about the disadvantage that poverty causes for families who can't afford private tuition, cramming, past paper exercise and practice, and all the other advantages, what are often called sort of home advantages, that come with sort of affluence and agency and that cavalcade of adults around you to support you in a continuous, almost 24 hours a day educational journey. And then we come to the norm referencing of exams, which requires learners to be labelled and sifted and put into rank orders, with a third of children getting the grades that are very unhelpfully called failure grades. When we look at those who are economically disadvantaged, that's more like 50% of those learners every year at each key stage and phase, effectively feeling that burden of failure as they then sort of progress out to the next stage, which inevitably impacts on their status, their self-efficacy, their self-esteem. So those children tend to come into our schools significantly behind, and they're unhelpfully branded and stamped as still being further behind as they progress through each of the key stage hurdles. As a sixth former really poignantly described to me not that long ago, it's as though you're a slab of meat with a kind of stamp of A class or A grade or another grade, at the end of the journey. So assessment clearly isn't working for all. And lastly, I'd just like to return to a point which has been made and touched on a couple of times today already, about the fact that it isn't just the exams themselves that are inequitable, it's the impact of the exam system and the high stakes accountability based on exam outcomes on pedagogy, which also has, a hugely pernicious effect. So that teachers are painfully cognizant of the fact that school league tables are based on exam success. Therefore, they're under pressure to cover hugely ambitious content in the syllabus or whatever they're teaching, which leaves them with less time to address the gaps. And we know that our underserved learners typically will have more learning gaps that need addressing if they're to progress at a healthy rate. Those teachers have less time to develop the relationships that really cement children into a sense of belonging in school, which is necessary for them to thrive. They have less time to uncover and discover the full range and breadth of young people's learning skills and potential. And they have less time for the learning or coaching conversations that would enable underserved learners to develop the self-efficacy and belief that they can be in control of their learning journey and successful lifelong learners. And lastly, as I see far too often when I go around classrooms and schools, because exams are sat in test conditions, in individual exam desks with a prescribed distance between yourself and the candidates to your side and at the front and behind, there's somehow this sort of feeling that learning with others is cheating, and that in the classroom what we need to do is be aping the conditions of the exam hall in order to prepare young people for exam success. So there's a real absence, I feel, in our classrooms up and down the country at the moment of collaborative learning opportunities, project-based, evidence-based, inquiry-based learning, and that's what our underserved children need so desperately, to feel that they belong in the classroom, belong in the school. At the moment, I think the belonging that we're seeing in schools is that definition of belonging where you need to fit in to our way of doing things, our standardized, inflexible assessment system, therefore our standardized, inflexible pedagogical kind of techniques. And that's not the sort of belonging that we really want for our children, that Bridget Phillipson was talking about in her talk to CST in November, when she talked about 1 in 3 15-year-olds not feeling a connection to school.
Thank you, Rachel. Wow, tremendous amount of issues there. But we have started to see some of the solutions emerging today. Special educational needs, well, it's talked about a lot in the press right now. It's trendy to talk about how impossible it is to sort it out. Can you tell us what we're going to do about it, please?
I say, can we rewrite the narrative and the way that we're framing the discussion about special educational needs? Please, can we talk about education systems? Because that is fundamentally the system that we're working in. And SEN, SEND, wider inclusion. There's many different strands of need and inclusion that we should be considering. We start fundamentally with an education system that works for all, and we consider the breadth of our learner population, of those who are in school and those who are not in school and may not be in school through choice, may be in school because school isn't the right environment for them currently. We need to improve on that. So I'd say let's demystify SEND by saying the SEND population is there because we're defining them as such, and we really need to talk differently and to recognise that all learners have differences, have preferences. All learners will engage with an education system that plays to their strengths, to their talents. All learners would benefit from a fundamentally different system for assessment, and that also means a different system for curriculum, because we just cannot separate them out. I remember going to talk to DFE shortly after I'd taken up post at Nason. I said, do you know, Department for Education, I'm so grateful that you've asked us to deliver this fantastic programme of CPD to teachers, to colleges, early years practitioners. So the numbers of children and young people in schools with special educational needs is increasing because they're being identified. We've got confidence, we've got practitioners that spot earlier and actually know where to go to raise concerns. So the numbers are increasing in schools. That's because awareness is increasing. But the way in which we're asking schools to respond and to plan for needs and to deliver a curriculum hasn't. And equally, the success measures for the school, i.e. accountability, and in accountability is the ability of learners to achieve and to achieve against a very prescribed, if I look just at post-16, if I look at the 11 to 16 curriculum, we're really talking about GCSEs as that great big marker of success or otherwise. So fundamentally, the system needs to change. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of very demotivated teachers, school leaders, an education system, and fundamentally learners. And the Department for Education said, we don't have ministerial interest in working on that area at the moment, and strongly advised that I at Nason should put our energies elsewhere, not into curriculum and assessment. So could appreciate it wasn't top of the list for the Department for Education, and they have to look at things in a sequential way. Completely understand. Can't achieve everything at the same time. But it meant that my work was to go behind closed doors and have quiet words, quiet conversations, and to talk to bodies such as Pearson, such as OCR, to talk to the professional associations, the teaching unions, and to find that many more across education and what I would call the allied professions, so health and social care, felt the same. So it feels right now we have a change in ministers and policy direction, that we genuinely have the perfect lineup to press for the assessment system that's going to work for education. And within that, that means that it will work more effectively for learners with SEND needs. But we have to drive it for the whole education system. And the time is now. And I was delighted to be invited here today because talking to an audience that primarily running schools, mainstream schools, whether they're independent or in the state system, is absolutely the audience that I want to talk to. There's certainly aware that a number of parents have made decisions to educate their children outside of the state system because of the flexibility of assessment primarily and the ability for their children to be able to shine and show that they can achieve. And I have to reflect that I am somewhat disappointed that our teaching profession has had the joy and the time and the energy sucked out of their week so that they couldn't turn their attention to creating more diversity within the national curriculum that they deliver, and where our multi-academy trusts have actually had the freedoms and flexibilities to do things differently, but they've been so jammed full of all the things that they couldn't step away from, that they haven't had the energy to look outside and to see what else could be done. They're doing an amazing job in the circumstances, and I think we can't say we've achieved all that we need to for SEND until we've got a system that's different. It's not the profession that needs to change, it's the system. And then, only then, will we have the results that we need and the education system that we need and opportunities without limits. If I could just say, just finally, there's a whole cohort of young people who, until fairly recently, I would say, didn't really have their needs identified and then certainly not met. And these would be young people who are neurodiverse in our school systems, who one could describe as having a spiky profile. They really are able and capable of greater depth at a chronological age, different to their peers. So some subjects they could attain a GCSE or even an A-level in at an earlier chronological age than in the national curriculum. And yet, in some areas, they would need support. Now, in the state system, unfortunately, they wouldn't always be prioritised. And I think we have a groundswell of support for the loss of talent that, as a result, if we don't really support our neurodiverse learners to do all that they can do. And I really say the philosophy of learning without limits is one that should be there for all, and that includes those with great depth and with potential, as well as those who have the most profound and fundamental needs.
Thank you, Annamarie. And the fact that you're with a Rethinking Assessment crowd is a testament to the fact that, we are people who want to do something about this. The inequity in the system has gone on for far too long, so hurrah. Over to you, Sammy. If you could carry on sorting it, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't know about sorting it, because one of the things that I'm a bit obsessed with what I call the big picture of schools, because I think that what we do is we get very involved in the detail, we get very involved in how to bring students on, and sometimes we don't ask a really key question. And this is what I set out to do in my book. I wanted to ask the question, what is school for? Why do we have it? And I think the answer is really revealing when we think about equity, because actually, researching the book led me to do a bit of historical research. And my favourite little fact that cropped up out of that was that William Gladstone, the Prime Minister who introduced the Education Act of 1870 that started universal education in Britain, he said the reason for universal education was really, really simple. And it was the Franco-Prussian War. And he said, if we had universal education, we could have an army as good as the Germans. And that tells you such a lot. In fact, there's another guy, Sir James K. Shuttleworth, and he made a plea to the Tories in the 1850s, saying that the Conservatives should naturally be the party of universal education because there is nothing so conducive to public order. And that is this huge unspoken contradiction at the heart of our system, is that actually many of the systems, the historic systems that have evolved around universal education in Britain, are systems that are not designed to lift people up. They're systems designed to hold people down. And what we have nowadays is we have a system that looks like it is an equitable system. But actually different parts of it have very different functions. And when I say different parts, sometimes we can think about different schools. But actually, I think we should think about schools within schools. Now, Diane Ray talks about this really interestingly. She talks about the fact that for many children, they will go through their schooling defined not by the nature of the whole institution, but by the nature of their set, their class. Are they with the clever kids, the middle class kids, or with the problem kids at the bottom? And that sense of this kind of deep division, I think then has to be put through another massive unspoken problem. I've loved today, I've really enjoyed listening to everything that's been said, but there's something missing. We've been talking about school. We've been talking about assessment. We haven't been talking about what happens after school, because that defines what happens in school. Now, I worked for 12 years in London, and then I moved up to Sunderland. And what I noticed straight away was my students were qualitatively different in Sunderland than they were in London, not because of income, but because of opportunity. And that when I spoke about things like careers or universities, my students in London, even when they were disadvantaged, could see it. They could see it around them, they could respond to it, they understood it was available. When I went to Sunderland, it was not available. It was not there. And if I had this revelatory conversation. I ran a program, we still do run it in the school, together with Oxford University and Durham, about trying to get students to kind of apply to high-value university courses. And there was a particular student, really bright, English, my subject's English, she was so sensitive, so she would have slotted right into an Oxford course, right? And she did this program, and then she said, no, I'm going to apply to Durham. And Durham's obviously still a great university, fantastic. But I said, God, do you not want to go for like the very best? Sorry, anyone from Durham. But it is, Oxford's the name, and it opens the doors. And she said, no, it's too far away. I want to be near my nan. And I had a moment of thinking, am I going to argue with this? And I thought, who am I to argue with that? Who am I to say that there is value in moving from your family, moving from your friends, moving from everything you know? And that is one of the great divisions in the country that we do not talk about. It's the fact that actually if you're from a working class community, the likelihood is all of your connections are in your immediate geographical location. And therefore to move away to have social mobility, I should say full disclosure, I was on the Social Mobility Commission for 3 years, and by the end of it, I had a huge problem with the term social mobility, because I found the idea that we were saying to people in a Norman Tebbit kind of way, get in your bike, I found that hugely problematic. And what you actually see, if you look at the narratives of social mobility, you see that people who do make that move lose something. So I suppose what I'm saying, if I kind of bring this back, is that unfortunately I don't think I can fix it, because I think that I think the problems, we have to recognize an element of which these problems are massive. They're about how we conceive of our society. They're about how we conceive of what it is to grow up, of what education is for. Now there is a big risk here in the stuff that we're thinking about. There is a risk that we look at, say, something like GCSEs and we say, oh, they're not doing what we need, so let's do something different to kind of try and get that forward. But we forget who we is. And here's a problem. Everyone in this room, the we that is in this room, are the successful ones. We, in education, by default, are the people who did well at school. We are the people who like school because we chose to go back to it and stay in it day after day, listening to the bells go off and standing in the yard and, in my case, being swooped on by seagulls and shat on a regular basis. But we are not everyone. And the system that we have is reverse engineered. A-levels are designed to lead towards university. GCSEs are designed to lead towards A-levels. And what that means, for the forgotten third that Rachel referenced, for the majority of people who go through our system, they complete a qualification at 16 that does not do what they need for their lives. We have designed a system around the winners only. And we really need to make sure that we listen to the voices of those who have not won in that system.
Wow, thank you. There is something here as well about ranking. We do love to rank people in this country. There's a lot in our language about, knowing your place, not getting above yourself. So there is something very endemic that is within our society. But we're here to try and think differently. So any questions, thoughts for our panel? And we will send a microphone your way. You don't have to have all the answers. There's somebody over here. Thank you. Run like the wind.
We can put you top of the leaderboard for running.
Hello, you might know me as the cougher. It's just asthma, don't worry, you can't catch it. I thought everything that's been said has been extremely helpful and true. It strikes me that, and I think this comes out particularly in how we deal with disability when it comes to formal assessments, that and I'm somebody who had 25% extra time when I went to university, and I got put in a special place with all the other special people, and it felt very much like that. It occurs to me that we have a picture of what normal is, and then we make accommodations for people who don't meet that standard. So exactly as Sammy's saying, we've got a picture of what you should be like, and then we have to deal with the fact that somebody doesn't fit that. We have somebody whose brain isn't as it should be, and therefore we make accommodations to make the assessments kind of work for them, but fundamentally certain people will never shine in that idiom. And I think it's absolutely the case for everything that Rachel was talking about as well. So I think, Annamarie, you mentioned about, design an education that works for all right from the beginning. And I think that actually intrinsically, the way that we're thinking about, can we design an education that is adaptable for these people is the wrong question. It's who are the people, what is the need, then what do we design? So that's not a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Really great contribution. Any other thoughts? Gentleman right at the top up there. Thank you. Standing by the door.
Thank you. At the risk of committing the sin that all politicians do of extrapolating policy from personal experience, I wonder what you think, in particular, Sammy, though I confess I haven't read your book. In my case, having two neurodiverse teenagers who probably should not have done very well, at great personal expense, in the broader sense, have done really quite well. I won't be modest here because it doesn't help my cause. Mainly because I know a lot about education, and I'm from an independent background where we tended to believe we could do anything with the system that we wanted because we were clever or whatever. And that's what public school gives you, right? And so they've done very well by hacking the system, by getting through all the barriers, finding alternative ways round, getting funding where needed, getting support where needed, because you just don't take no for an answer, and you figure out a way, because there's always a way. But that basically means, and here's the idea, that if each person who's underserved and underprivileged and neurodiverse, if they had the right sort of advocate and advisor steering them, then I think things would be a lot better. Is that possible, practical?
I'm going to be slightly grim and say no. Not that it wouldn't work, but that it isn't possible. Because one of the things is that the very nature of underserved is, right, if I put it a different way, one of the surprising conclusions I came to after writing my book is that I found myself becoming quite anti-choice. I find choice in education actually increasingly problematic. And the reason I do so is because it's not the children choosing, it's the parents. And actually the parents are the gateway to the child. And the problem is that no matter how great the advocate is, it's the parents that they have to find and deal with. And actually sometimes anyone who's worked in underserved communities will recognize that sometimes the ones you want to reach the most are the ones who are the furthest away from you. So it is a very difficult thing to actually get in and make connections to a family that is deeply alienated from education. So I think there is value in what you say in terms of it would have an impact, but again and again and again, we butt up against a fundamental problem in our society, which is that all the structures we've put in place around education, none of them make up for the deficits that children get by being badly parented or having the lack of parenting. Now, having said all that, there is a kind of more positive way to think about it, which is that what you describe in terms of hacking the system, the complex system. I think maybe if we hack the whole system and we kind of find the shortcuts that allow and prioritise the needs of those who don't have the advocates, then that maybe equalises things between those who have advocation and those who don't.
Can I just
Rachel,
add into
yes.
that? So, as I was listening to you talk, it reminded me of the late, great Tim Brickhouse, who talked about the hedges and finding the holes in the hedges. And I think what you were describing with your children was finding holes in the hedges. And I think that's what all teachers do, all head teachers do. You know, they appreciate the hedges and they try and get their scissors out and cut them down a bit or find holes through them. And that's you know, one way of tackling it. I think that was really what you were asking. But I think, going right back to this morning and our colleagues from the exam boards, you know, there are ways in which we can make the hedges of standardised formal testing lower and more navigable. You know, open booked exams, taking out the sort of the pressure of time limits and allowing people to celebrate great ideas percolating and taking a little bit of sort of reflection time. The idea of taking exams when you're ready, as opposed to everybody having to sit exams on a particular afternoon in June, and lots of people realising that they're not sort of prepared. Degrees of optionality within exam papers to allow for the curriculum to be different for children from different contexts and with different sort of interests. Thinking about criterion referencing more than norm referencing, more interdisciplinary style assessment. So there are all sorts of ways in which I think we could be finding the holes in the hedges. And then just to go back to the concept of a digital learner profile, I think the reason that we're so passionate about that at Rethinking Assessment is we think there's a much better way of partnering a degree and a number of standardised assessments with the opportunity to orally articulate or articulate through video demonstration one's skills in working with others in team or collaborative ways, to have sort of micro-badging of achievements out of school or beyond the sort of formal curriculum, and also to create a vehicle for that sort of me as a learner piece of work that encourages a 14-year learning conversation between each learner and a champion or a learning coach for them, that enables them to progress out of the education system far more self-aware of themselves as a learner and far more able to articulate to an employer or anybody of importance who they'll encounter in their lives themselves and their learning strengths, and to feel proud of themselves as a holistic learner.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Annamarie.
Okay, I'll try to be ultra succinct then. I really wanted to say that when I talked about designing a system that's for all learners, that really has to be ultra inclusive and to go far further than anywhere is currently. That's what we have to aim for, and we shouldn't build another school in this country. We shouldn't spend a penny of public money without ensuring that that building is fit for purpose. And then we should ensure that, and that means, sort of lighting, accessibility, and having every classroom environment just plugged in to be digitally enabled. And a future that is supported by digital will have the capability to be able to be inclusive of a range of needs within a classroom setting, and we think differently to classrooms as they are now. But that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be spending any more money on building a building or adapting and having to always add on. We should think outside the box, and we should think far broader than we ever have done, and be brave. But then we need to keep everybody's spirits up by saying, but there are some things we can do now, we can do next week, we can change immediately. Do you know a really simple one is to adopt learner profiles? And if we did that from the earliest years all the way through education, and to say, dare we say, that could also go with one into employment or post-16. That's putting information in the hands of young people. It's putting in the hands of parents and families. It's trusting them to be part of that partnership in parents in their role in supporting education. And it means that for young people who unfortunately have movements of schools and education, that their story, their strengths go with them from one place to another rather than retelling. And if there's a view that that learner has some additionality, some additional needs, well, there's a whole history then of all that they have been doing, of their uniqueness. And if we did that, that's a relatively low-cost solution that I don't think we'd find many schools and settings objecting to. And 2 years ago, almost, at a NASON conference, we put up a Slido and said, just out of interest, is anybody using a digital learner profile currently? 96% of the audience said yes on the Slido poll. They didn't know the question was coming, nobody'd warmed them up about what to think or how to respond. That was absolute raw response. And of that, the additional percentages were all keen to know more if there was a resource available that they could use. So we've got a teaching community that's willing to embrace digital, whatever others might say about it being too hard or not in their comfort zone, and that could be a huge lever, and I think we could make a big difference by adopting learner profiles for all.
Well, thank you very much. Defining success much more broadly is what we're all about. Thank you for the panel. Thank you, everybody.